Amid the rhythm of modern life, when the mind is constantly stretched taut by information expectations and questions that never quite find their answers, perhaps what exhausts us most is not the world outside, but the effort to understand everything. To understand ourselves, to understand others, to understand life, to understand even the universe turning silently beyond us. And then at night, when all external sounds fall quiet, it is precisely those questions that awaken within us. This video was not created to offer answers. It was created to give you rest from the need to understand. Tonight, you do not need to discover the meaning of life. You do not need to decode your own mind. You only need to listen as if standing very still beneath a vast night sky where the stars remain even when we do not fully understand them. In this quiet space, philosophy does not arrive as a lecture but as a whisper. Each slow reflection, each gentle story guides you through the universe outside and the universe within yourself. As the philosopher once wrote, the mystery of life isn't a problem to solve, but a reality to experience. And perhaps in this moment, the most important experience of all is allowing yourself to let go and to sleep in peace. When human beings first lifted their gaze toward the night sky, it was likely not an act of science, nor quite a philosophical question. It was something far more primordial, a moment of stillness, a moment of silence. When the fire had begun to fade, when the sounds of the day had settled, and above them remained only a vast black dome scattered with cold, distant points of light. In that moment, there was no language to name the stars, no concept of the universe or of time. And yet one feeling was unmistakably clear. They were standing before something far greater than themselves. Human curiosity did not begin as a desire to conquer, but as confusion, a sensation that was both fearful and magnetic. The night sky offered no answers, yet it caused questions to arise on their own. What are those lights? How long have they been there? And do they in some way look back at us? No one taught humans to ask such questions. They arrived naturally like breath itself. Perhaps because from the very beginning the human mind was shaped in a way that could never fully accept absolute silence. And yet what is strange is those first questions had no answers at all. And for a very long time, humanity lived alongside them. No maps, no theories, no solutions. Only the sky and not knowing. At that time, not knowing was not a source of shame. It did not carry the weight of failure. It was simply the natural state of existence. Human beings did not feel that they needed to understand the universe in order to be allowed to live within it. Much later, when philosophy began to take form, that upward gaze was finally given a name. Aristotle wrote in Metaphysics, "All men by nature desire to know." This line is often quoted as a declaration of human reason, but when listened to slowly, another layer reveals itself. The desire to know does not arise from confidence, but from absence, from a gap, from the sense that there is something out there we have not yet touched. Night is where that gap becomes most visible. By day, the world busies itself covering not knowing with action, with noise, with purpose. But when night falls, when light weakens, familiar things lose their outlines, and the sky with its immeasurable depth becomes a quiet mirror. In it, human beings do not only see the stars, they see their own smallness. That sense of smallness is often misunderstood as something negative. Yet, in the history of thought, it carries a very different quality: humility. Blaise Pascal once wrote in Pensées, "The eternal silence of these infinite spaces frightens me." The fear Pascal describes is not simply fear of the infinite, but the trembling of the self when it realizes it is no longer at the center. A very quiet fear, not panicked, not dramatic, just a gentle touch, yet strong enough to loosen every certainty. And still, within that smallness, there is a peculiar comfort. When we are no longer the center of everything, the burden of needing to understand, to control, to explain begins to lighten. The night sky does not demand that we become smarter. It asks only that we stop, look, and admit that some things were never made to be fully understood. Carl Jung once said in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." In this sense, the night sky itself becomes a symbol of that darkness, not a darkness to be banished, but one to be faced, to be accepted. When humans look up at the sky, they are not only confronting the universe, but also their own unconscious, the place where unanswered questions quietly reside. Perhaps that is why gazing at the night sky has always carried a healing quality. even when we cannot name why. In that moment, the usual stream of thought slows. Personal anxieties begin to feel smaller within a larger picture, not because they do not matter, but because we recognize that they are not everything. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, "One must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star." This line is often read as a celebration of creative force, but beneath the night sky it also suggests something gentler. The inner chaos of a human being is not a flaw. It is natural, and the sky with its silent stars reminds us that even within chaos, some form of order exists whether or not we yet understand it. When a person stands beneath the night, there is no need to reach conclusions, no need to choose a belief, no need to resolve contradictions. One only needs to be there, to breathe, and to allow questions to exist without answers. In the modern world, this has become a rare skill. We are accustomed to needing immediate understanding, immediate reaction, immediate solutions. But night does not move at that pace. It teaches a different rhythm, the rhythm of waiting. And perhaps it is precisely this rhythm that makes it easier to fall asleep while thinking of the night sky. Because sleep itself is not an act of force. We cannot command ourselves to sleep. We can only create the conditions for sleep to happen. Just like looking at the sky, we do not demand that it speak. We simply listen to its silence. Tonight, as you close your eyes, perhaps somewhere in your subconscious, the image of the night sky remains. It does not need to be clear. It does not need detail. Just a feeling of depth, of vastness, of knowing that you do not need to understand everything in order to be allowed to rest. And within that smallness, paradoxically, there is a very great peace. As the human gaze grows accustomed to the night sky, as the feeling of smallness before the infinite becomes less overwhelming, the mind begins to do what it has always done. It tries to tell a story. Not to conquer the sky, but to live alongside it. From those silent points of light, humans begin to ask not only what is there, but where everything began. And it is at this fragile meeting point between wonder and the need to understand that the concept of the Big Bang is born. Yet the Big Bang, contrary to popular imagination, is not an explosion. It is not a loud moment that shattered some primordial stillness. There was no fire igniting in darkness, no central blast, no fragments hurled outward into space. The Big Bang, when listened to slowly, feels more like a breath, an opening, a very quiet expansion occurring everywhere at once. This sounds paradoxical because the human mind is accustomed to imagining every beginning as a forceful act, a collision, a distinct event. But the universe does not follow the narrative habits of human thought. It does not happen in one particular place. It does not begin at a point and then spread outward. There is no origin to point at, no edge from which to stand outside and observe. The universe does not explode into anything because from the very start there was no elsewhere to explode into. When science says that the Big Bang is the expansion of space, it means that the distance between all things is increasing. Galaxies are not moving through a static background of space. Rather, space itself is gently stretching. Every point moves away from every other point, and for that reason, every location can feel as though it is at the center, even though in truth no center exists. This idea of having no center carries a deep philosophical echo. For much of history, human beings have placed themselves at the center of the story, the center of the world, the center of meaning, the center of attention. But the universe, through the idea of the Big Bang, seems to whisper something very different. There is no privileged position, no favored viewpoint. Every place is simply a place within the infinite. The philosopher Baruch Spinoza once wrote, "In ethics and nature there is nothing contingent, but all things have been determined from the necessity of the divine nature to exist and produce an effect in a certain way." Though Spinoza was not speaking of the Big Bang in the modern physical sense, his thought touches a similar intuition. The universe does not revolve around human desire or perspective. It exists according to its own internal order, without an audience, without a center, without the need for personal explanation. When we imagine the Big Bang no longer as a violent explosion, but as a silent unfolding, something within the mind begins to soften. The beginning of everything no longer feels aggressive or chaotic, but natural, slower, gentler, and harder to grasp. Much like the way sleep arrives, not with a sudden collapse, but with the gradual dissolving of wakefulness. The idea that there is no outside of the universe also causes the mind to hesitate. We are used to thinking that everything must exist within something larger, a room, a landscape, a background. But the universe is not contained within anything. There is no edge to step beyond, no empty space surrounding it. Every question about before or outside eventually reaches a boundary where language and intuition begin to fail. Immanuel Kant once pointed out in Critique of Pure Reason that there are questions reason cannot answer not because we are insufficiently intelligent, but because the very structure of reason is not designed to handle them. He called these antinomies contradictions that cannot be resolved. In this sense, the Big Bang is not only a scientific issue, but a lesson about the limits of understanding itself. And perhaps it is here that the Big Bang begins to take on a healing quality. Not because it explains everything, but because it allows us to pause before something that cannot be fully imagined. It reminds us that not every beginning needs to be grasped. Not every question needs an answer for life to continue. Alan Watts once wrote, "In the wisdom of insecurity, trying to define yourself is like trying to bite your own teeth. Searching for a center of the universe is, in a way, similar. We look for an absolute anchor of meaning, while meaning itself may simply be a continuous movement without a final resting point." When listening to the story of the Big Bang at night, what matters is not understanding every physical concept. What matters is sensing its rhythm. A universe opening, a space breathing, a beginning without noise. And within that opening, we are also allowed to loosen ourselves, to release the need to locate, to stand at the center, to know exactly where we fit within the whole picture. Perhaps this is why the Big Bang, though it speaks of the beginning of everything, feels so close to the end of a day. When we prepare to sleep, the world does not disappear in an explosion. It simply recedes. Thoughts stretch out. Worries lose their central position. There is no outside to escape to only a gentle sinking inward. The universe does not explode into anything, and we do not need to go anywhere. In this moment, as the story of the Big Bang is told like a lullaby, we can allow ourselves to remain still within a space that has no center, no pressure to understand, only a very slow unfolding. And within that slowness, sleep begins to arrive as a natural continuation of the same flow that began at the very beginning. When the story of the Big Bang settles, when the image of a universe without center, without edge, without an outside slowly dissolves into the fabric of night, a very natural feeling arises in the human mind. How much in the end are we actually able to see? Not how much knowledge we have accumulated, but how much reality truly reaches this fragile field of awareness. And it is here that our journey drifts into an even quieter region, the region of limits. Science calls the portion of the universe we can see the observable universe. The term sounds confident, almost decisive. Yet when listened to carefully, it carries a deep humility. The observable universe is not the whole universe. It is only the part that light with its finite speed has had time to reach us since everything began to expand. Not because there is nothing beyond it, but because we have never seen it. And perhaps never will. Stated quickly, this idea can feel unsettling, but spoken slowly, it holds a strange comfort. It suggests that the world does not demand that we know everything, that not seeing, not touching, not measuring is not a failure of intelligence, but a natural condition of existing within a finite body. Nothing is being hidden from us. We are simply standing at a certain distance at a certain moment in time. Long before telescopes or equations, philosophy had already sensed this. Plato in the Republic told the story of the cave where humans see only shadows and mistake them for the entirety of reality. Though the story does not speak of the universe in a physical sense, it touches the same intuition. What we see is not all that exists. And the mistake is not that we see too little, but that we forget how little we are seeing. When night falls, when the sky opens above us, that limit becomes easier to feel than at any other time. We see the stars, but not the emptiness between them. We see light, but not the worlds whose light has not yet departed. We see a dome of sky, but not its true depth. And then, in that absence, the mind often does what it knows best. It fills the gaps. With assumptions, with beliefs, with stories that make us feel safer in the presence of the unknown. But in the slow rhythm of the night, we can try another choice, not to fill the space, simply to look, and to accept that some things lie beyond the reach of consciousness. Ludwig Wittgenstein once wrote in Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, "Whereof one cannot speak thereof, one must be silent." The silence he speaks of is not surrender, but respect. Respect for the limits of language, respect for the limits of understanding, and perhaps respect for the limits of ourselves. Seen this way, knowledge is no longer a blazing torch meant to drive away all darkness. It becomes more like a small light in the fog, enough to take a few careful steps forward, not enough to dissolve the mist in the distance. And if we move too quickly, too confidently, that small light can even blind us, causing us to forget how much remains unseen. This does not make knowledge meaningless. On the contrary, it returns knowledge to its proper place, a humble tool, not a master key that opens every door, but a means of not becoming completely lost in the night. Immanuel Kant, in Critique of Pure Reason, clearly distinguished between phenomena, what appears to us, and noumena, what exists in itself beyond our capacity to know. He did not say that noumena do not exist. He only said that we cannot know them in the same way we know other things. At this point, a part of us may want to resist. We want to believe that one day, science will advance far enough, the light will grow stronger, and all fog will disappear. Perhaps that is true, but even then the boundary only moves back, it does not vanish. For every answer opens new questions. Every new illuminated region is surrounded by an even wider darkness. And if we allow ourselves to see this slowly, we begin to realize limits are not necessarily enemies of peace. It is the acceptance of limits that allows the mind to rest. When we stop trying to see through every layer of fog, stop demanding that we fully understand the world, a subtle lightness begins to appear. We no longer have to stand guard over all of reality. In Depth Psychology, Carl Jung spoke of the unconscious not as a territory to be conquered, but as an ocean of which consciousness is only the surface. He wrote in Psychological Types, "The unconscious is not just evil by nature, it is also the source of the highest good. What we cannot see, cannot understand, cannot name, is not necessarily a threat. Sometimes it is precisely the space in which the soul can breathe. When we carry this understanding into sleep, everything softens. Sleep does not require us to understand the day we have lived. It does not ask us to resolve every question about the universe or ourselves. It only asks that we let go, to lower the light, to accept that in the night we need only enough illumination to feel safe, not enough to see everything. And perhaps this is the thread that has quietly connected our journey from the beginning. From the moment humans first looked up at the sky, through the story of a big bang without an explosion, to the recognition of the limits of understanding, all of it whispers the same message: the universe was not created for us to fully comprehend. And this is not a failure, it is an invitation to step away from the center, an invitation to accept uncertainty, an invitation to allow ourselves, at least for tonight, to remain within a circle of just enough light, so the mind no longer strains to search, but can slowly drift like a dim lamp in the fog, not guiding the whole universe, but simply guiding us toward our own sleep. When the dim light of understanding has helped us accept the limits of what can be seen, when the mind grows familiar with the idea that not everything lies within reach of awareness, the next natural step of the journey leads us toward an image even deeper, even quieter: the black hole. Not as a cosmic monster that devours everything, but as a subtle boundary where the very idea of going back slowly loses its meaning. In popular imagination, black holes are often portrayed as enormous pits, violent forces dragging everything into an abyss. But when the scientific story is listened to slowly, a different image emerges, gentler and far more profound. A black hole is not a vacuum cleaner. It does not suck in space. It bends space so extremely that every path leads inward, much like Earth bends the moon's orbit, only to a far more radical degree. And the most important boundary of a black hole does not lie in its dark center, but at the event horizon. A name that sounds dramatic, yet carries a surprising stillness. The event horizon is not a wall. There are no warning signs, no violent moment of impact. For the one who crosses it, nothing special happens at that precise boundary. Only one thing changes very quietly: the ability to return disappears. It is like the horizon at sea. When you stand on the deck of a ship and look outward, the horizon is always there. You can move toward it, but you never reach it. And once you have traveled far enough, the familiar shore behind you slowly slips out of view. The event horizon works in much the same way. It is not a place where something happens, but a place where a possibility ends. This idea reaches deeply into human experience. In life, we often imagine boundaries as dramatic moments, a decision, an event, a shock. But in truth, many of the most important boundaries are very quiet. We step across them without noticing. Only when we look back do we realize that we no longer have the option to return to who we were before. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard once wrote in The Concept of Anxiety, "Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom." The dizziness he describes is not so different from standing before an invisible boundary. Before crossing it, we are free to choose. After crossing it, that freedom transforms. It does not vanish, but it takes on a different shape. The event horizon of a black hole in this sense is not only a physical phenomenon, but a precise metaphor for the irreversible moments of inner life. What matters is this: a black hole does not break the laws of the universe. It only pushes them to their limit. Space bends until every direction points inward. Time slows until the idea of later becomes blurred. And information, the thing humans cling to in order to feel safe, can no longer travel outward. Not because it is destroyed, but because the path to leave no longer exists. Albert Einstein showed in Relativity, the Special and the General Theory, that space and time are not fixed stages, but flexible entities shaped by mass and energy. A black hole is simply the extreme continuation of that insight. It reminds us that what we consider foundational space-time direction is far more fragile than everyday experience suggests. And when we bring this image into the slow rhythm of night, something unexpected happens. The black hole becomes less frightening. It becomes quiet, almost meditative. Because in a world that constantly urges us to move, to respond, to go back and fix things, the idea of a boundary where returning is no longer an option carries a strange sense of relief. Not everything needs to be undone. Not every moment needs an exit. Fyodor Dostoevsky once wrote in Notes from Underground: Man is a mystery. It needs to be unraveled, and if you spend your whole life unraveling it, don't say that you've wasted time. But perhaps the black hole whispers something else. Not every mystery needs to be unraveled. Some mysteries exist simply as they are, not to be solved, but to mark a limit. In depth psychology, Carl Jung often spoke of facing the shadow, the darker part of the soul, not to eliminate it, but to acknowledge its existence. A black hole in this way resembles the shadow of the universe, not a flaw in the system, but a natural consequence of space-time itself. And that shadow does not need to be fully illuminated for life to continue. As night deepens, as the body grows tired, the mind approaches a very personal event horizon, not of space, but of wakefulness. Sleep does not arrive with a collapse. It arrives when we cross a subtle boundary where thoughts still exist, but no longer have the power to pull us back into control. We do not fall asleep. We slide into it very gently. And just as with a black hole, the moment of crossing that boundary is rarely remarkable. No sound, no clear sign, only a change in the structure of experience. Time is no longer measured in minutes. Space contracts into sensation. Worries do not disappear, but the pathways that allow them to stir consciousness quietly close. Perhaps this is why the black hole, when told in the slow cadence of a philosophical night story, becomes not a symbol of destruction, but of release. A release from returning to old thoughts. A release from the need to understand more. A release from keeping consciousness constantly alert. And in that release, nothing is lost. There is only a natural movement into another state, like the universe bending space, like night bending time, like sleep bending awareness, just enough to carry us across a boundary from which we do not return, not to vanish, but to rest. In the end, a black hole is not a place where everything ends. It is a place where familiar concepts stop. And in that pause, there is a profound stillness. A stillness that, if we allow ourselves to feel it, can guide us more gently than any explanation into the sleep already waiting on the other side of the night. When we have grown familiar with the idea of the black hole as a point of no return, when the mind has softened before the image of space curved so deeply that every path leads inward, a new question begins to arise very quietly. Not a challenging question, but more like a whisper in the night. What if anything lies on the other side of that boundary? And it is precisely at this hazy edge that a hypothesis appears, not loudly, not with certainty, but gently, as a suggestion, the idea of a universe inside a black hole. In science, this hypothesis is known as black hole cosmology. But what matters most especially in tonight's journey is not the terminology or the equations. It is the attitude the idea carries with it. This is not a declaration of ultimate truth. It does not demand belief. It does not seek to replace one model with another. It simply offers a possibility that what we call the universe may be only one layer within a larger structure, like circles nested within circles with no clear beginning and no absolute end. In this telling, a black hole is not merely a place where everything ends, but perhaps a place where another space-time begins, a child universe born from the collapse of a parent universe. And if this were so, then each black hole in our universe might contain another universe within it, silent, separate, unable to communicate. A universe within a universe. Not like rigid boxes, but like dreams within dreams, each layer with its own logic, its own time, its own light. Heard too quickly, this idea can jolt the mind into wakefulness with its scale. But heard slowly in the breathing rhythm of night, it carries a strangely gentle quality, because it does not ask us to understand the structure. It only reminds us that reality may be far deeper than what we are experiencing, and that not reaching the bottom is not a failure of consciousness, but one of its natural traits. The philosopher William James once wrote in The Varieties of Religious Experience, "Our normal waking consciousness, rational consciousness as we call it, is but one special type of consciousness, whilst all about it parted from it by the filmiest of screens. There lie potential forms of consciousness entirely different." James was speaking of consciousness, yet his words resonate uncannily with the intuition behind black hole cosmology that what we live within, however vast it seems, may be only a thin layer separated from other structures by the most delicate of screens. What matters is this: the hypothesis does not need to be proven to be meaningful in an inner journey. Its value does not lie in whether it is right or wrong, but in how it softens the human craving for certainty. When we allow ourselves to imagine the universe as a nested structure with no absolute center and no final layer, we simultaneously allow ourselves not to be the final answer to our own existence. In everyday life, we often carry a quiet pressure to become a finished version of ourselves, to know who we are, where we stand, and where we are going. But the idea of universes within universes whispers something else. There is no final layer, no state of being that is ever truly complete. Each stopping point is only a temporary boundary within a deeper structure. Martin Heidegger once wrote in Being and Time, "The more we press forward into the future, the more we are driven back into the past. The more we understand ourselves, the more mysterious we become. This becoming more mysterious is not a failure of understanding, but a sign that we are touching depth. Much like looking into a black hole and seeing nothing, not because there is nothing there, but because our way of seeing has reached its limit." When told as a night story, black hole cosmology no longer feels like a distant physical theory. It becomes a delicate metaphor for human experience. Each memory, each dream, each layer of the unconscious can be seen as a child universe within a larger structure we call the self. And just like universes within black holes, these layers do not always communicate with one another. We do not remember everything. We do not understand everything. We touch only a very small portion of the whole process unfolding within us. Carl Jung wrote in The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, "The unconscious is not merely something that lies there, but something that is happening. If the unconscious is an ongoing process, then imagining it as a nested space far deeper than conscious awareness no longer feels strange. And when we accept that there will always be layers of ourselves beyond the direct light of understanding, a quiet relief begins to appear. No assertion, only suggestion. That is the rhythm this idea wishes to keep. It does not say that our universe certainly lies within a black hole. It merely invites us to consider the possibility that reality does not need to be flat, simple, or finished where we happen to stand. And within that invitation lies a deep comfort. We do not need to understand the full structure of our lives in order to be allowed to live them." As the night continues, as consciousness softens, the idea of universes within universes begins to feel very close to the experience of sleep. Sleep, too, is not a disappearance. It is a shift of layers. Conscious awareness steps back. Other processes take over. The child universes of dreams, memories, and emotions quietly open without the supervision of reason. And just as with a black hole, we do not need to know exactly what is happening on the other side in order to allow ourselves to cross the boundary. We need only enough trust in the flow. Trust that not every movement requires light. Not every space needs to be named. Jorge Luis Borges, forever fascinated by nested structures of reality, once wrote in Labyrinths, "I have always imagined that paradise will be a kind of library, an infinite library where each book opens into another world with no final volume." In its own way, this image is very close to the idea of universes within universes, and very close, too, to the way the mind wanders when it is allowed to drift through the night. When this story comes to a close, no conclusion is offered, no truth is stamped into place. There remains only a feeling that reality may be deeper than we assume, and that this depth does not threaten our peace. On the contrary, it allows us to release the burden of holding all meaning at once. The universe may lie within a black hole, or it may not. Tonight, that does not matter. What matters is that we have allowed ourselves to imagine the possibility that everything could be wider, deeper, and gentler than the daytime need for control. And within that gentle opening, the mind can slowly settle as if drifting across another boundary, not of space, but of wakefulness into sleep, like a quiet child universe waiting to unfold. as the idea of a universe nested within a black hole gradually fades like the last trace of a dream. Lingering after waking, the mind naturally turns toward another question and lighter in tone. Yet no less haunting is the entire universe itself rotating. Not rotating in a hurried or chaotic way, but in a movement that is extremely slow, extremely steady, like the way night turns around us without our ever noticing. This question does not arise from intuition, but from very delicate observations. As humans began to look more deeply into distant galaxies, a small detail slowly emerged. Some galaxies appear to show a slight preference for rotating in one direction more than the other, a very subtle asymmetry. Not enough to draw conclusions, not enough to assert anything, but enough to make science pause, slow its breathing, and ask, is this real or merely an illusion created by the way we observe? In science, the most important moment is not when an answer is found, but when it becomes clear that the question remains open. The possibility that the universe might be rotating, if it exists at all, would challenge a very deep assumption that on the largest scales, the universe is isotropic with no preferred direction. Yet it is equally possible that everything we are seeing is simply observational bias, a result of our vantage point, of our measuring instruments, of the Milky Way itself moving through space. And here in this fragile overlap between data and interpretation, science reveals a quality very close to philosophy: humility. No rushing, no premature certainty, no turning doubt into belief. Only an acknowledgement something may be happening, and it may also not be. Albert Einstein once wrote, "The most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible." This sentence is often quoted as praise for the power of science. But when heard in the slow rhythm of night, another layer emerges. Even this comprehensibility is never complete. It always comes with blurred regions, gaps, small deviations that require every model to remain open. The idea of a possibly rotating universe then does not need to become a proven fact to be meaningful. Its value lies in reminding us that the way we see the world is always capable of being wrong. Not because we are careless, but because we always stand in a particular place at a particular moment with limits that are deeply human. This has a profound parallel in inner life. In our mental and emotional worlds, we often believe that we see ourselves clearly, that we understand others, that we fully grasp the situation we are in. Yet over time, those perspectives shift. What once felt certain becomes uncertain. Conclusions that once seemed solid reveal tiny distortions, small but enough to change the entire story. The philosopher Soren Kierkegaard once wrote in concluding unscientific postscript, "Life is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be experienced." Within this line lies a gentle reminder: not everything needs to be fixed by conclusion. Not every movement needs to be precisely determined for us to live alongside it. Whether the universe rotates or not, in some sense, resembles the question of life's meaning, important not because of a final answer, but because it keeps us awake to uncertainty. When science is unsure, this is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of honesty. To acknowledge the possibility of error is to admit that reality is always more complex than any model we construct. And within that admission, there is a necessary softness, especially at night, when the mind is tired of constant judgment. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote, in Beyond Good and Evil, the strength of a person's spirit would then be measured by how much truth he could tolerate. If we gently extend this thought beyond morality, it can be heard as a whisper about perception. Strength does not lie in clinging to rigid truths, but in the ability to tolerate uncertainty without rushing to fill it. The universe may be rotating, or it may not. But what is certain is this: science's willingness to remain still before that uncertainty creates a rhythm very different from the hurried tempo of human life. A rhythm that is slow, careful, listening. And when this rhythm enters a night story, it soothes more deeply than any forceful assertion ever could. Because at night, what keeps us awake is not a lack of answers, but an excess of conclusions. Conclusions about ourselves, about the future, about what must happen. When we allow ourselves to remain in the not yet certain as science does, before the question of cosmic rotation, a gentle breathing space opens. We no longer have to strain to hold a fixed position. We are allowed to say, maybe not yet, no need to decide. In the slow cadence of night, the idea of deviation becomes compassionate. Deviation is no longer an error. It is an unavoidable feature of observing from within. And if the universe itself may carry small and resolved asymmetries, then the moments when the human mind loses its bearings become easier to forgive. As you lie still, as the light fades behind your eyelids, you may no longer remember that you were listening to galaxies or to the motion of the cosmos, but perhaps one feeling will remain that you do not need to be certain of everything in order to be allowed to rest. That even science at the height of precision knows how to pause before the unknown. And in that pause, there is a deep peace, as if the entire universe, rotating or not, is moving slowly enough that you do not need to keep up. You do not need to stand at the center to understand. You do not need to choose a direction to believe in. You only need to remain here in this moment where every question is allowed to stay open and every conclusion is allowed to fall asleep with you through a night that is long and very gentle. As the question of the universe's motion slowly dissolves into uncertainty as we grow accustomed to the idea that even science knows how to pause before its own limits, tonight's journey drifts onward into another realization, gentler yet no less profound. Earth is not the only one. Not in a way that diminishes the value of the home we inhabit, but in a way that expands the picture, allowing us to breathe more slowly within a space far larger than we usually imagine. For a very long time, Earth was regarded as an exception, a rare point of light in a sea of darkness, the only place with liquid water, an atmosphere, and conditions suitable for life. That belief once brought comfort, the sense that we were special, that our existence occupied a privileged position in the universe. But as humans began to look deeper, as telescopes discovered planets beyond our solar system, something very subtle occurred. Uniqueness began to blur. Not because Earth became less precious, but because the surrounding context grew wider. Earth-like planets began to appear in the data, not perfect copies, but bearing familiar traits, stable orbits, comparable size, the potential for liquid water. They were given modest names, Earth-like planets, not promises, not proof, just enough resemblance to allow imagination to open slowly. And then alongside this, an even softer concept emerged: almost worlds. Worlds that almost became like Earth, almost had water, almost retained an atmosphere, almost lay at just the right distance from their star. A slight deviation, a higher temperature, a weaker magnetic field, stronger radiation, and every possibility quietly closed. No catastrophe, no explosion. Just a very small divergence, yet enough to alter an entire destiny. The idea of almost worlds carries a deeply human resonance. In life, we too often exist among almosts. We almost chose a different path, almost met a different person, almost watched everything unfold in an entirely different way. And like those planets, not every possibility becomes real. Most simply pass by in silence, leaving no trace in the memory of the universe. The philosopher Epicurus once wrote in letter to Herodotus, "There is an infinity of worlds both like and unlike our world." Though written long before modern science could observe exoplanets, this line holds a striking intuition that life, if it exists, does not need to be exclusive, and that the universe has no obligation to revolve around a single script. When we hear of these almost worlds, a very subtle feeling arises, not disappointment at no longer being the center, but a softening of the ego. Earth is not the only one yet. Neither is it replaced. It is simply one case that happened among countless cases that could have happened but did not. And because of this, its existence, our existence, becomes more fragile and at the same time more precious. Albert Camus once wrote in The Myth of Sisyphus, "The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart." In a cosmological context, that struggle can be understood as existing amid innumerable unrealized possibilities. No metaphysical meaning is required to justify it. Existence itself within a universe filled with almost worlds is already something worthy of quiet attention. At night, when we think of Earth-like planets orbiting distant stars, we may not feel more alone. Instead, a strange sense of kinship emerges, as if Earth too is merely one of many worlds trying to maintain balance between heat and cold, stability and chaos, persistence and disappearance. And in that silent effort, it is not so different from us. This idea carries its own healing power. It loosens the pressure to be exceptional. If Earth is not the only one, then we do not need to be perfect versions of ourselves in order to be allowed to exist. We do not need to conquer the universe. We only need to remain long enough for life to unfold in its own way. Carl Sagan once wrote in Cosmos, "We are a way for the cosmos to know itself." This line is often quoted as a bold affirmation, but heard slowly, it carries no arrogance. Only a quiet connection. The universe knows itself not only through us, but through every form of existence that has appeared, is appearing, or almost appeared. Almost worlds remind us that life is not guaranteed, it is not assured, it is not promised. And for that very reason, each moment of existence carries a weight that is light yet deep, not to make us anxious, but to invite us to live more slowly, to look more carefully, and to take less for granted. When we carry this idea into sleep, something gentle happens. Personal tensions lose some of their sharpness. Failures no longer feel absolute. Because if an entire planet can almost exist, and then not a single day that does not unfold as hoped is not a cosmic tragedy. It is merely a small variation within a far larger structure. And here, our journey of thought connects naturally. From accepting that we cannot fully understand the universe to standing before points of no return to imagining nested universes, and now to recognizing that our home is not alone yet not replaced. Each idea does not close the previous one, but softens. It widens, it makes it easier to breathe. As you lie still in the night, you may not remember the names of planets or the physical conditions that give rise to life, but perhaps one feeling will remain, that this existence, though not unique, is enough. Enough to be valued. Enough to be rested within. Enough that nothing needs to be proven to the vast universe beyond. Earth is not the only one, and for that very reason, you do not need to be the only one carrying all meaning. Tonight, among countless worlds that have existed, are existing, or almost existed, you may allow yourself to become a very small, yet very real part of that story. And within that permission, sleep arrives not as an escape, but as a gentle quiet merging into a larger flow that continues softly on. As the idea of almost worlds lingers like a very thin afterimage, our journey drifts onward into a quieter, heavier region, a place of possibilities that never took form. No longer worlds that almost existed, but worlds that once had a chance and then quietly failed. Not through loud catastrophe, but through changes so slow, so natural, that no one could name the moment when the ending occurred. In the universe, life is not a promise. It is a temporary process dependent on countless fragile conditions. A star needs only to alter its breathing, slightly shining a little brighter, growing a little hotter, and the delicate balance tips. Oceans may evaporate, climate cycles may unravel, and a world that was once warm, once wet, once chemically favorable to life, gradually becomes silent. A star's change carries no malice. It does not attack its planets. It simply continues to evolve in the most natural way available to it. In the long rhythm of the universe, stars are born, age swell, contract, and fade. And when that rhythm drifts beyond a habitable range, the worlds that depend on it must adapt or disappear. There is no failure in a moral sense, only incompatibility. One of the clearest signs of that incompatibility is the loss of atmosphere, not overnight, without collapse or noise. Just thin layers slowly eroded by stellar winds, radiation, and time. As the atmosphere thins, water can no longer be held. When water departs, the capacity to sustain life leaves with it. And then a planet may continue to orbit, continue to exist physically, yet no longer remain a living world. This idea may sound sad if measured by hope, but when heard slowly, it carries a gentler truth: life is not guaranteed. There is no permanent contract, no long-term assurance. Only a window of time, if we are fortunate, during which life can unfold. David Hume once wrote in an inquiry concerning human understanding, "All our reasonings concerning matter of fact are founded on a species of analogy. We infer the future from what has already occurred, but the universe is under no obligation to continue according to our familiar patterns. Failed worlds remind us that what has happened does not always repeat, and what exists does not always endure. Yet in tonight's story, failed worlds do not appear as warnings. They appear as silent mirrors. They show us that life is not a reward for being correct, but a temporary result of balance. And when balance shifts, outcomes shift with it without judgment, without regret. This bears a deep resemblance to human life. How many relationships once had the conditions to endure only to dissolve when circumstances changed? How many dreams came close then faded, not because anyone was wrong, but because the conditions no longer aligned? We often call these things failures. But the universe, if it could speak, might call them by another name: phase transitions. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, "One must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star." But he also understood that not every chaos gives rise to stars. Some chaos leads only to silence. And this does not make it meaningless. It simply shows that possibility is never distributed evenly. When we think of failed worlds at night, a strange softening occurs. For if life is not guaranteed on a planetary scale, then the moments when a personal life slips out of orbit feel less abnormal. We do not need to blame ourselves because not everything lasts. We do not need to treat every ending as a mistake that must be corrected. Albert Camus once wrote in The Myth of Sisyphus, the struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. But here, another layer emerges. Even when the summit is never reached, the journey still belongs to reality. Failed worlds once rotated, once had weather, once hosted complex chemistry. They are not meaningless simply because life did not persist on their surfaces. This is where the healing quality of this chapter resides. It does not celebrate existence by denying endings. It accepts endings as part of the structure. And when endings are placed in their rightful position, the fear surrounding them begins to soften. In depth psychology, Carl Jung emphasized that maturity does not come from keeping everything intact, but from allowing what no longer fits to dissolve. He wrote in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain, and we might add, there is no rest if we insist on holding everything in its former shape." Failed worlds then do not tell a pessimistic story. They tell a story of finitude, a very calm finitude. Not tragic, not dramatic. Simply this: some things unfold for a time and then close when conditions change. When you carry this idea into sleep, you may feel lighter. The anxieties around having to hold on, make things last, ensure permanence begin to lose their weight. You do not need to protect everything from time. Not even the universe does that. And here, the current of our thought continues seamlessly. From recognizing that Earth is not the only one to acknowledging that many worlds could not sustain life, we learn a very quiet lesson: existence is not a victory. It is a temporary state of balance. And when balance shifts, no one needs to be blamed. Tonight, among worlds that once had a chance and then fell silent, you may allow yourself not to be an exception. You do not always have to endure. You do not always have to maintain. Some days, the most complete form of existence is simply being allowed to close a thought, a worry, a loop. And in that gentle closing, like a planet slowly settling after its atmosphere has thinned away, the mind, too, can ease into a deeper stillness. No promises, no guarantees. Just slow breathing and letting sleep arrive as a natural process, not as a failure of wakefulness, but as the soft continuation of the same current that has always been quietly flowing. As the story of failed worlds slowly settles, as the image of planets that once had a chance drifts quietly away in the imagination, a very different realization begins to emerge, not heavy, not pessimistic, but gentle and quietly luminous. It is an awareness of the value of fragility, not as a flaw to be corrected, but as a condition that has silently given meaning to life itself. In this story, Earth is not a victor. It did not overcome other planets in any competition. It was not chosen. It did not prove anything. Earth simply remained. Remained after the long transformations of its star, after delicate orbits, after conditions that were just enough, no more, no less. And it is precisely this remaining unheroic and unremarkable that became the ground for everything we know and love. To say that Earth did not win is to release it from a very human role, the role of the deserving one. Life on Earth is not a reward for perfection. It is not the result of optimal design. It is the outcome of a chain of extremely fragile balances that could have tipped with the slightest change. And because of that, this existence is not self-evident. It is temporary. Hannah Arendt once wrote in The Human Condition, "The human condition is not the same as human nature. The conditions of human existence, like those of Earth itself, are not fixed essences. They are sets of circumstances that can change. And precisely because they can change, they become worthy of care rather than something to be taken for granted. Fragility often frightens us because it reminds us of the possibility of loss. But in the slow rhythm of night, fragility reveals another quality: softness. A fragile thing cannot withstand great force, yet it responds with exquisite sensitivity to gentle touch. Earth, with an atmosphere as thin as mist, with life dependent on delicate cycles, persists through balance rather than strength. This reflects deeply into human life. We often try to become strong, emotionally strong, strong-willed, resilient through pressure. Yet life, both on a planetary scale and a personal one, does not operate through constant force. It unfolds through the ability to maintain conditions that are just enough. Enough light, enough darkness, enough rest, enough letting go. Rainer Maria Rilke once wrote in Letters to a Young Poet, "Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves." To love unanswered questions is one way of loving fragility, without forcing, without closure, without demanding absolute certainty. When we see Earth as one that remained, rather than one that triumphed, a very quiet humility appears. There is no cosmic pride, no obligation to prove that this life was inevitable. Only a simple feeling this is happening and it deserves care. Albert Camus wrote in The Myth of Sisyphus, "Real generosity toward the future lies in giving all to the present." If Earth is not the result of victory, then its future does not need to be built through coercion. To care for life is not to ensure its eternity, but to honor its presence here now. The healing of this chapter lies in a shift of values. Worth does not come from lasting forever, but from existing fully within one's limits. A flower is not less valuable because it blooms briefly. A peaceful day is not meaningless because it cannot be repeated, and Earth is not small because it is not the center or the final destination of the universe. In Depth Psychology, Carl Jung emphasized that accepting finitude is an essential step in inner maturation. He wrote in Modern Man in Search of a Soul Life really does begin at 40. Up until then, you are just doing research. This is not about age, but about the moment when one stops trying to become immortal, stops trying to defeat time, and begins to live with an understanding of limits. When we carry this idea into sleep, a palpable lightness emerges. We do not need to cling to everything to prove our worth. We do not need to extend every moment. We do not need to turn each day into a victory. Some days simply remaining like Earth is enough. Here, the current of this journey becomes seamless. From recognizing that life is not guaranteed, we do not fall into despair. We fall into appreciation. For only what is fragile truly calls for our attention. Only what can be lost invites us to pause and look more closely. Earth simply remained, and within that remaining are oceans, forests, sleep, and very human thoughts unfolding in this night. And you in this moment are also simply remaining after a long day, after worries, after unfinished things. No victory is required, no proof is needed, no greatness must be achieved. Tonight you may allow yourself to be fragile, not as a weakness, but as a truthful state of being alive. And in that accepted fragility there is a profound peace. Sleep in the end is also an expression of fragility. We release awareness, we release control. We trust that the body and the world will continue to move without our supervision. And like Earth, we do not conquer the night. We remain within it long enough to rest. And perhaps it is precisely in remaining no more, no less, that we touch the gentlest value of existence, not strength, but a soft endurance, just enough to carry us through this night and into a quiet, restful sleep. As our journey passes through fragile worlds, as the idea of Earth simply remaining has softened the need to win or to prove anything, a very natural movement takes place not in the universe, but within the human body itself. It is a movement so familiar that we rarely question it. Why do we sleep? Sleep is often understood as a shutdown, a blank space, an interruption of consciousness. But if we listen slowly, if we look at sleep with the same gaze we have given the universe, something else comes into view. Sleep is not a stopping, but a transition into another way of being. Just as Earth does not disappear when night falls, the mind does not vanish when we close our eyes. It simply changes its rhythm. In waking life, the brain functions like a tireless gatekeeper. It sorts, it evaluates, it compares. It keeps the self upright in the world. But this work consumes an enormous amount of energy. And at some point, that system needs to step aside, making room for another mode, quieter, deeper, less controlling. Sleep is not the extinction of awareness. It is a temporary retreat from the role of control. Science calls this a state transition, but philosophy sensed it long ago as a change of worlds. Heraclitus once wrote, "The waking have one common world, but the sleeping turn aside each into a private world." In this brief line, sleep is not treated as a deficiency, but as a doorway into another world, more private, less bound by shared logic, and therefore closer to the deeper layers of the human being. When we sleep, the brain does not stop working. It does not rest. It simply stops doing what the day demands of it. Instead of turning outward, it turns inward. Instead of holding everything in rigid order, it allows connections to soften. Memories are reorganized. Emotions are processed. Experiences that could not be digested while awake are carried into a slower rhythm where they no longer press so hard. There is something deeply healing in this idea. It tells us that even when we are doing nothing, the body and the mind still know how to care for themselves. Sleep is not the laziness of consciousness. It is trust that there are processes which do not require the supervision of the ego in order to unfold at the right time. William James, in the Principles of Psychology, described consciousness as a continuous stream not divided into isolated moments. From this perspective, sleep is not a break in the flow, but a bend in its course. The stream does not disappear at night. It simply runs through a different channel, deeper, darker, and quieter. This matters greatly in the modern world, where many carry an unspoken fear: if we stop, everything will collapse. If we do not control, we will lose our way. But sleep repeating itself every night is silent proof that letting go of control does not lead to disintegration. On the contrary, it is the condition that allows the system to rebalance itself. Aristotle, in On Sleep and Waking, understood sleep as a natural and necessary state of life, not an error or a lack of wakefulness. He knew that life cannot be sustained in a single mode. Every enduring system requires rhythm between activity and stillness, between light and dark, between attention and release. When we place sleep within the same line of thought as the earlier chapters, a clear continuity appears. The universe has no fixed center. Earth did not win. Life is not guaranteed. And sleep at the personal level is not an achievement. It does not arrive because we did everything right. It arrives when the conditions are just enough. In inner life, many people turn to sleep as a form of escape. But listen to more carefully, sleep does not escape reality at all. It continues to work with reality, only in another language. Vague images, fragmented dreams, nameless emotions. These are all ways the mind continues the story of the day, freed from rigid logic. Carl Jung once wrote in Modern Man in Search of a Soul, "Dreams are the guiding words of the soul." This does not demand that we analyze our dreams. It simply reminds us that when consciousness steps back, another part of the human being is allowed to speak. And that part does not need bright light. It works best in the soft darkness of sleep. The healing of this chapter lies in changing how we view exhaustion. Fatigue is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign that we have traveled far enough in the day, and sleep is not a reward for effort, but a natural requirement of a living system. Just as Earth needs night to balance its heat, the mind needs sleep to balance meaning. As you lie down tonight, you may still carry unfinished thoughts, unanswered questions, unnamed emotions. But sleep does not require you to complete them. It asks only one small thing: allow the brain to shift into another mode. A mode that does not optimize, does not judge, does not measure. Here, the current of our journey continues naturally. From accepting Earth's fragility, we learn to accept our own fragility at the end of the day. We do not need to be stronger. We do not need to understand more. We do not need to hold on to anything else. Sleep arrives not when everything has been perfectly arranged, but when we stop demanding that perfection. Just as the universe does not need a center to function, the mind does not need constant control to find peace. And in this moment, as the light softens, as the breath slows, you may allow yourself to do what both the universe and Earth have always done: change state, not disappear, not fail. Simply move into another rhythm where everything continues in silence. There, in that slower rhythm, sleep is no longer something you must achieve. It is something already waiting the moment you stop trying. Once we accept that sleep is not a shutdown, but a transition, the next part of the story unfolds naturally. Sleep is not a single unbroken block, but a rhythmic journey with layers of depth, with returns and departures, like the quiet tide of consciousness. And within this rhythm, the mind discovers how to rest without disappearing. Sleep begins with the non-REM stages, where everything settles very slowly. The heart rate softens, the breath becomes more even, the body releases the tensions it carried through the day. This is not a realm of vivid images or dramatic narratives. It resembles an inner dusk where light fades without announcement. In non-REM, consciousness withdraws from the center, making room for a deep quiet in which the body repairs itself, renews itself, and remembers that it is more than a tool for daytime goals. From that stillness, sleep then drifts into REM, a very different region. The body lies almost motionless, yet the mind begins to move. Images arise. Stories, unconstrained by ordinary logic, start to weave themselves. If non-REM is where the world turns off its lights, REM is where another world turns them on without the rules of daylight, without linear order. Here, memory, emotion, and imagination blend into a softer, deeper language. What is remarkable is this sleep does not choose one over the other. It does not remain forever in silence, nor does it sink entirely into dreaming. It alternates. Non-REM, then REM, settling, then moving, resting, then storytelling. And this cycle repeats many times through the night, as if the mind understands that healing requires both silence and expression. In the slow cadence of night, this carries a deeply human meaning. It tells us that rest is not the elimination of movement, but the discovery of the right rhythm for it. Human beings cannot remain still forever, nor can they move endlessly. Just as the universe has shown us cycles of opening and quieting, sleep teaches that sustainability comes from knowing how to return. Heraclitus once wrote, "The waking have one common world, but the sleeping turn aside each into a private world." If the waking world is governed by shared rules, then the layers of sleep are where each person follows a personal rhythm. Yet this rhythm is not chaotic. It has structure. It has cycles. It repeats just enough to keep the mind from losing its way. Science describes these cycles with charts and brainwaves. Philosophy, however, sees something more familiar returning to the body in non-REM, returning to memory and emotion in REM, then returning again to the body, like the in-breath and the out-breath, like day and night, like the seasons passing without explanation. Aristotle, in On Sleep and Waking, understood sleep as an indispensable part of rhythmic life. He knew that no form of life can persist in a single state without exhausting itself. And this is true not only for the body, but also for meaning. Meaning, too, must be allowed to settle, to blur, so that it does not become a burden. In modern life, we often expect sleep to be a straight line. Lie down, sleep deeply, wake up. But the mind does not function that way. It needs to circle. It needs to revisit unfinished matters through different paths. Non-REM loosens tension. REM continues the stories that daylight did not leave enough space to tell. Marcel Proust once wrote In Search of Lost Time, "The real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes." In REM sleep, we do not travel to new places in a physical sense. We are given new eyes with which to look again at old fragments of memory. And in this re-seeing, a quiet healing takes place because it happens when the ego has stepped aside and no longer demands control. What is worth noticing is this repetition is not a sign of being stuck. On the contrary, it is a sign of stability. A healthy system knows how to return to the states it needs rather than pushing forward endlessly. In sleep, there is no idea of going farther. There is only the idea of going enough. Here, the thread of our journey continues seamlessly. From accepting the fragility of Earth, we learn to accept the fragility of our own inner rhythms. From understanding that the universe does not require a center, we learn that sleep does not need a fixed destination. It only needs the right cycle. Carl Jung once wrote in The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, "The dream is a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul." That door does not open once and remain open. It opens and closes, closes and opens in cycles. And each opening allows the mind to touch deeper layers that daylight cannot reach. As you lie down tonight, you may not feel whether you are in non-REM or REM, and that is perfectly fine. Sleep does not require monitoring. It does not need you to do it correctly. It asks only that you allow the cycle to unfold, allow the body to settle, allow the mind to move, allow both to take turns doing what they have known how to do for a very long time. The healing of this chapter lies in letting go of expectations of a perfect sleep. There is no need to sleep deeply all night, no need to have beautiful dreams. Simply let the layers of sleep do their work quietly, steadily, without applause. And if during the night you wake between cycles, that too is not a mistake. Sleep is not broken by a pause. The cycle will continue, like a tide that recedes and returns, like a breath that hesitates and then becomes smooth again. In the end, the layers of sleep remind us of something very gentle. Rest is not about reaching the deepest point, but about knowing how to circle back. Not forcing ourselves to sink endlessly, nor pulling ourselves up endlessly. Just repeating the rhythm that is just enough until body and mind find their own balance. And within that very slow repetition, you do not need to do anything more. The cycle has already begun the moment you allowed yourself to lie still. The rest, like the universe moving in silence, will unfold on its own, carrying you through this night, through each layer, very gently, very deeply, and very quietly. When the layers of sleep have begun to alternate in gentle rhythm, when the body settles into non-REM, and the mind quietly opens in REM, a phenomenon both familiar and mysterious appears: the dream. Not loudly, not with announcement, not asking permission. Dreams arrive like a silent current, a natural continuation of a journey in which consciousness has temporarily stepped away from the center. For a very long time, human beings have asked, what are dreams for? Are they meant to foretell the future? To conceal a hidden message? Or are they merely meaningless remnants of a resting brain? But if we listen to dreams with the same slow cadence with which we have listened to the universe, something else comes into view. Dreams do not exist to explain, they exist to arrange. During the day, our consciousness continuously gathers data. Images, sounds, emotions, small details, and major events crowd together in an unbroken stream of experience. Not everything is fully processed. Many memories are recorded only roughly. Many emotions are not yet named. And when night arrives, when the ego steps back, dreams begin the work that daytime did not have enough space to do processing memory. Yet processing here does not mean organizing according to logical order. Dreams do not function like a neat library. They function like a very gentle recycling workshop. Fragments of memory are cut loose from their original contexts and recombined through new associations. A familiar face appears in an unfamiliar place. A small event carries the emotional weight of a much larger one. This is not a failure of memory, but the way the brain searches for meaning beyond linear time. Sigmund Freud once wrote in The Interpretation of Dreams, "Dreams are the royal road to the unconscious." Though Freud's interpretations have been widely debated, his intuition remains striking. Dreams do not speak in the language of reason, but in the language of images and emotions. And this language does not need to be correct to be effective. It only needs to touch. Alongside memory, dreams serve another gentle function: emotional rehearsal. In dreams, we can experience fear without real danger. We can feel sadness, love, or loss without real-world consequences. Dreams create a safe space, even when frightening, where emotions are allowed to move to release some of the pressure accumulated during the day. Carl Jung wrote in Dreams, "The dream is the small hidden door in the deepest and most intimate sanctum of the soul. That door does not open to judge us, but to allow suppressed emotions a way out. No need for verbal explanation. No need for immediate understanding. Only the permission to be experienced." And perhaps the most subtle role of dreams lies here, organizing chaos. By day, the world reaches us in fragments. Work memories, news, desires, anxieties, all layered together without a natural order. Consciousness tries to hold them within a temporary structure, but eventually that structure becomes overloaded. Dreams do not erase chaos. They restructure it according to another order, the order of symbols, associations, and inner rhythm. The philosopher Gaston Bachelard wrote in The Poetics of Reverie, "Reverie is a state of soul more than a state of mind. Dreams in this sense are also a state of the soul where nothing needs to be precise, only real enough to be felt. What matters most is this: dreams do not require us to understand them. Trying to decode every dream upon waking can sometimes work against their function. Dreams have already completed their task during the night, whether we remember them or not. Like many deep processes of the body, they do not need the supervision of consciousness to operate effectively. Here, the current of this journey becomes especially seamless. From accepting that the universe does not need to be fully understood, to accepting that sleep does not need to be controlled, we learn another very gentle lesson. Even the mind has parts that function best when left alone. Marcel Proust once wrote in Search of Lost Time, "The true paradises are the paradises that we have lost." Dreams often return us to places that no longer exist. An old room, a familiar face, a feeling we cannot quite name. Not to trap us in nostalgia, but to remind us that memory is still alive, still being rearranged, still seeking integration with the present. When speaking of dreams in a Philosophical Night podcast, the goal is not to make the listener more alert, but to make them less afraid of what unfolds during sleep. Dreams are not signs of disorder. They are signs of activity. They show that the mind is working diligently to keep you whole even when you are unaware of it. And if some dreams are tangled, illogical, or even frightening, this does not mean that something is wrong. Sometimes chaos must be passed through before it can be organized. Sometimes emotions must be amplified in dreams so that their intensity can soften in waking life. Dreams are not trying to make you comfortable. They are trying to make you complete. Tonight, as you lie still, you may not remember what you dreamed. The images may dissolve quickly upon waking. But this does not make the dream meaningless. It has already done its work quietly, steadily, without needing recognition. Here, the rhythm of the telling can slow even further. The voice can grow lower, the words more spacious, because dreams do not need many explanations. They need space. Dreams do not arrive to explain life, but to soften it. Not to give answers, but to lighten the weight of questions. In that softening, the mind can drift more deeply into sleep, not as a disappearance, but as a very gentle continuation of the same current that began the moment you closed your eyes. And as you sleep more deeply, Dreams will continue processing, rehearsing, arranging like a silent craftsman working in the dark. You do not need to watch. You do not need to understand. You do not need to remember. You only need to remain still. The rest the mind has known how to do for a very long time. When dreams have quietly completed their work, processing memory, rehearsing, emotion arranging what was once chaotic, a very simple truth begins to surface in the background of the night. Even as you lie still, the body is never truly still, not through large movements, but through silent, persistent activity unfolding beyond the reach of conscious attention. And within this quiet persistence, there is a deeply healing story. By day, we often experience the body as a solid whole, a stable, familiar self. But when listened to with the slower rhythm of night, the body reveals itself as more like a river than a stone. Cellular renewal is constantly taking place without instruction, without supervision. Old cells complete their role and quietly depart. New cells appear and take up the next task. There are no farewells, no welcomes, only a seamless continuation. Seen closely, this idea softens our fear of change. It shows that change is not always an event. Most often, change is simply the background rhythm of life. Your body has understood this for a very long time, long before you ever learned to question it. And at night, when consciousness withdraws, that rhythm becomes more visible than ever. Heraclitus once wrote, "No man ever steps in the same river twice." This is often quoted about the outer world, but it is equally true of the inner one. You of last night and you of tomorrow morning are not exactly the same, not because you have become someone else, but because the body has quietly renewed itself. Alongside renewal, energy exchange never ceases. Every breath is an exchange. Every heartbeat is a current. Energy enters, transforms, and then leaves. There is no infinite storage, no absolute stillness. Life exists through circulation. And when circulation is blocked, fatigue appears not as a moral failure, but as a signal asking to be heard. Here, a gentle thread reconnects us to the earlier chapters. The universe has no fixed center. Sleep is not a shutdown. Dreams do not need to be understood to be effective, and the body at the most intimate level does not require constant control in order to function. What it needs are conditions that are just enough rest, rhythm, and trust. Baruch Spinoza wrote in Ethics, "The body cannot determine the mind to think, nor can the mind determine the body to motion to rest or to anything else. Not because they are separate, but because they operate through subtler laws of interaction than command. When you sleep, you do not instruct the body to repair itself. You create the conditions in which repair can occur. Night offers the most favorable rhythm for these processes. Temperature lowers, stimulation fades, the nervous system shifts into a conserving mode, and within this softening, the body begins its quiet labor repairing micro-injuries, rebalancing chemistry, redistributing energy in more sustainable ways. No bright light is needed. No attention is required. Only time. This carries a deeply healing message for a tired mind. You do not need to do anything in order to recover. Some forms of healing only happen when you stop doing, when you stop measuring, when you allow yourself to remain still. Like a forest regenerating after winter, the body needs spaciousness to continue its cycle. Maurice Merleau-Ponty in Phenomenology of Perception emphasized that the body is not an object we possess, but the way we exist in the world. Heard at night, this creates a subtle shift of roles. Instead of using the body to move through the world, we allow the world through air, through darkness, through rhythm to pass through the body. Here, the pressure to remain the same as yesterday begins to dissolve. If the body is never still, then not being exactly as you once were is not a sign of decline. It is a sign of continuation. Each day, the body renegotiates its relationship with the world, taking in, letting go to keep life at a state that is just enough. Not perfect, not eternal, but enduring. Rainer Maria Rilke once wrote in Letters to a Young Poet, "Live the questions now." The body lives those questions in its own way, not through thought, but through transformation. It does not ask, "Who am I?" It asks, "What do I need to continue?" And at night, the answer is often simple: less. Less stimulation, less effort, less control. If during the day you feel as though you are standing still, stuck, exhausted, not progressing, this chapter whispers something gentle beneath that feeling. Movement is still taking place. Not the movement you can see, but the movement that keeps you alive. And that movement does not need to be pushed, it needs to be allowed. As you lie down, try to sense the body as a city at night. By day it is loud, by night it grows quiet, but it never stops working. Repair crews move through the streets. Energy is redistributed. Overloaded areas are relieved. No announcements, no spotlight, only silent efficiency. At this point, the flow of the journey becomes smooth and continuous. From the vastness of the universe to the intimacy of dreams, from the fragility of Earth to the fragility of the body, the same lesson repeats itself. Life endures through rhythm, not force. Through repetition, not breakthrough. Through exchange, not accumulation. And so tonight, you do not need to hold yourself together tightly. You do not need to monitor every thought. Allow the body to continue the work it has performed billions of times before renewing, exchanging, balancing with the patience only ancient living systems possess. Sleep, then, is not an empty space. It is the body's working time. A quiet night shift that requires no manager. And you, in your simplest role, need do only one thing: allow. Allow the rhythm of night to pass through you. Allow movement to unfold in silence. Allow the body not to be still so that you may truly rest. The rest, like a river flowing through darkness, will continue on its own, very gently, very steadily, carrying you deeper into sleep where everything is tended to without explanation. Once we accept that the body is never truly still, that beneath the quiet of night there exists a network of silent motion, the next chapter opens through very small details, strange yet gentle truths. They do not overwhelm us. They do not demand belief or deep understanding. They merely touch us lightly enough to remind us that life is unfolding within every millimeter of the present moment. First comes a fact that sounds almost like poetry. Human beings emit a faint light. Not a light visible to the naked eye, but a very subtle glow produced by biochemical reactions inside our cells. As energy is transformed, tiny photons are released quietly, continuously. We do not shine like stars, but we are not entirely dark. And this does not happen when we do something extraordinary, but simply when we live, when we breathe, move, and exchange. Heard at night, this carries a deep calm. Light does not need to be brilliant in order to exist. It does not need an audience. It does not need to be seen. It only needs the right conditions to appear. In the same way, a person's value does not need noise to be real. It can be present very thinly, very steadily within ordinary acts that no one records. The philosopher Simone Weil once wrote, "In gravity and grace, attention taken to its highest degree is the same thing as prayer." Attention at its deepest is not effortful strain, but the recognition of small things already present. The body's faint light, when attended to, becomes a quiet prayer, not directed outward, but returning us to presence. Then comes another truth so simple we often forget it: our height changes. During the day, under the weight of gravity, the spine compresses. At night, when we lie down, the discs gently expand. We wake up slightly taller, not by much, but enough to show that the body knows how to give space back to itself. This change requires no effort. It requires posture and time. Here lies a tender metaphor. There are parts of us that can only lengthen when we stop bracing. Only when we lie down, when we release the pressure of having to stand strong, do we recover our natural measure. Not to become larger in anyone's eyes, but to return to what is just enough. Heraclitus once said, "Nature loves to hide." Nature does not advertise how it heals. It conceals itself in slow movements, in repeating cycles. The body is the same. It does not announce its recovery. It simply works very quietly. And then another truth appears, unexpected yet kind. Skin is constantly shedding. Each day, old cells fall away, new ones take their place. We do not lose skin in a tragic sense. We renew it in a natural one. The surface through which we touch the world is continuously refreshed, not for beauty, but for protection and adaptation. Heard in the slow rhythm of night, this offers a real comfort. There are parts of us that are allowed to fall away without drama, without declaration, without clinging. Letting go can be a biological function, not only a mental decision. The philosopher Epictetus wrote in Enchiridion, "Do not seek for things to happen the way you want them to. Rather wish that what happens happen the way it happens." Skin does not resist time, it cooperates with it. And through that cooperation, the body maintains its wholeness. These three small truths, faint light, changing height, shedding skin, placed side by side, form a gentle picture. Life does not require drama to function. It does not depend on leaps or breakthroughs. It moves through very small steps, repeated long enough to become endurance. And that endurance is quiet. Here, the flow of thought connects naturally with the previous chapter. If the body is never still, then these subtle movements are its most tender evidence. Not movement to achieve, but movement to sustain. Not to become more than someone else, but to continue being oneself. Maurice Merleau-Ponty in Phenomenology of Perception spoke of the body not as an object we possess, but as the way we exist in the world. When we glow faintly, when we lengthen in the night, when we shed our skin, the world is passing through us and we are responding with our biological rhythm. These truths also carry a healing effect for a tired mind. They remind us that not every change needs management. Not every movement requires a goal. Some processes function best when we stop staring at them. Rainer Maria Rilke once wrote in Letters to a Young Poet, "Let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final." The body lives this sentence in a very concrete way. Sensations come and go. Cells come and go. Length comes and goes. No feeling is final. No state is fixed. As the night deepens, as the voice softens, these strange facts become a kind of scientific lullaby. They do not awaken curiosity in a way that keeps us alert. They reassure us in a way that allows us to rest. They say even when you do nothing, life is still being cared for. If during the day you feel faint or unnoticed, remember that a subtle light is still present. If you feel compressed by pressure, remember that the body will expand when allowed to lie down. If you feel the need to release something old, remember that skin leaves every day to protect what lies beneath. At this point, you do not need to remember details. No numbers are required. Nothing needs to be retold. Simply let these light images pass through you like a dim phosphorescence in the dark, like the slight increase in height by morning, like old skin leaving without pain. And in that passing sleep finds another reason to arrive. Not because you have fully understood your body, but because you have stopped asking it to explain itself. You have allowed these gentle truths to do their work quietly, steadily, without applause. In the end, these strange facts whisper something very kind. You do not need to shine brightly to be light. You do not need to be taller to be enough. You do not need to keep every old layer to remain safe. Life knows how to balance itself through very small movements. Tonight, as you close your eyes, allow that faint light to continue glowing. Allow the spine to lengthen. Allow what is no longer needed to fall away. You do not need to watch. You do not need to control. You do not need to do anything more. Simply lie still and let these gentle truths rock you into sleep where all movement continues. Very small, very steady, very quiet. When the gentle truths about the body have settled the faint light, the subtle change in height, the quiet shedding of old layers, a deeper realization begins to surface without effort, without analysis. You are an ecosystem, not a machine, not a single will, but a living totality where countless processes unfold at the same time, most of them beyond the control of consciousness, yet operating with a remarkable harmony. By day, we are used to thinking of ourselves as the one in charge. We believe that if we think carefully enough, if we control tightly enough, everything will move in the right direction. But when night falls, when consciousness grows tired, another truth gently reveals itself. Most of what keeps you alive does not wait for your command. The heart beats, the lungs breathe, cells divide. The immune system keeps watch. The bacteria in the gut work quietly. Each process has its own rhythm, its own rules, its own timing, and you do not need to monitor each of them for life to continue correctly. Heard quickly, this idea can feel unsettling. Lack of control sounds like a threat, but heard slowly in the cadence of night, it becomes deeply liberating. Lack of control does not mean chaos. It can mean another kind of order, one that does not place the ego at the center. Baruch Spinoza wrote in Ethics, "Nature does not act with an end in view. Nature does not operate according to moral goals or personal intentions. It moves according to its own structure. And you as an ecosystem are no different. You do not need a perfect plan for every cell to know what to do. You need the right conditions, rhythm, rest, and permission. Within you is a community, not metaphorically, but quite literally. Trillions of microorganisms live with you, exchanging substances, sending signals, influencing emotion, sleep, and even thought. You do not simply have a body, you are a living environment. And that environment does not function through commands, but through balance. Strangely enough, the more we try to impose absolute control, the more strained the ecosystem becomes. Just as a forest does not need someone standing at its center shouting instructions for trees to grow in the right place, the body does not need constant supervision from the ego to sustain life. It needs space, space to adjust, space to repair itself, space for small deviations to be absorbed rather than amplified. Here, a very soft thread reconnects us to the earlier chapters. The universe has no center. Earth did not win. Sleep is not a shutdown. The body is never still. And now we see more clearly you are not the controller of the ecosystem, you are part of it. An important part, but not the only one. Maurice Merleau-Ponty in Phenomenology of Perception emphasized that the body is not an object we possess, but the way we exist in the world. Heard at night, this brings a subtle shift. Instead of managing ourselves, we begin to be with ourselves. Instead of issuing commands, we listen. And what is astonishing is this: even though you do not control most of what is happening, the ecosystem still functions perfectly in its own sense. Perfect not because it makes no mistakes, but because it can self-regulate. Perfect not because it never changes, but because it knows how to change at the right time. When there is tension, the body looks for release. When there is injury, it initiates repair. When there is overload, it draws you towards sleep. The biologist and philosopher Gregory Bateson spoke of nature's wisdom as residing in feedback loops rather than linear commands. Even without direct quotation, this idea resonates clearly. Here you do not need to know every cause in order to feel the effects of balance. You only need not to disrupt those loops with unnecessary strain. In inner life, we often blame ourselves for not being able to control emotions. Sadness comes and goes. Anxiety appears without warning. Thoughts wander in the night. But when seen through the lens of an ecosystem, emotions too are like species within an inner environment. They arrive, perform their function, and depart when conditions change. Trying to eradicate them often causes more harm than allowing them to pass through. Carl Jung wrote in The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, "What you resist persists, not because emotions are stronger than will, but because ecosystems react against force. When we allow rather than resist, many things recalibrate faster than we expect." The healing of this chapter lies precisely here. It does not ask you to abandon responsibility. It simply invites you to loosen the illusion of total control. You still have a role choosing conditions, choosing rhythm, choosing rest. But you do not need to carry the burden of operating every detail. Rainer Maria Rilke wrote in Letters to a Young Poet, "Have patience with everything unresolved in your heart. Patience with what remains unresolved is the most fitting attitude toward an ecosystem. No forcing, no rigid framing, no demand for immediate results. As night deepens, as consciousness fades, the inner ecosystem gains more room to work. Processes hidden during the day come forward, small balances are adjusted, feedback loops close and open again, and you do not need to do anything to help them, only not to interfere. If today you feel as though you are not functioning well, this chapter whispers something very kind. Perhaps you are using the wrong measure. An ecosystem is not judged by short-term efficiency, but by its ability to sustain life over time. And by that measure, you are doing very well even on the days you feel weak. In the end, realizing that you are an ecosystem brings a very particular kind of peace. It allows you to remain within uncertainty without panic. It allows you to trust that there are parts of you that know how to care for themselves far better than the strictest commands ever could. Tonight, as you close your eyes, try to sense yourself as a resting forest. Not absolutely silent, but filled with small movements. A very light wind leaves barely stirring soil, quietly shifting temperature. No one commands that forest, and yet it lives. It balances. It endures. So do you. Not in control, yet functioning. Not perfect in a rigid sense, yet complete enough to continue. And within that very quiet trust, you may allow yourself to rest more deeply. No need to stand guard over the entire inner world. The ecosystem is familiar with darkness. It knows what to do when you sleep. The rest, as nature has always done, will unfold in silence, carrying you through this night very slowly, very evenly, and very peacefully. Once we have seen ourselves as an ecosystem, not needing to control every detail, yet continuing to function with quiet endurance, the story naturally widens beyond the human, touching other living beings who share this planet with us. There we encounter abilities that the daytime mind might call superpowers, but which in the slow rhythm of night appear simply as gentle ways of continuing to live. There are creatures that regenerate, not in a mythical sense, but through a biological rule so simple it feels almost miraculous. A part is lost, and another grows back without haste, without panic. This regeneration carries no heroism. It is the patience of living tissue knowing how to return to a form that is sufficient to continue existing. When we look at this, a familiar burden begins to loosen the belief that loss must always mean an ending. In nature, loss is often a turning point. Aristotle wrote of entelechy, the inner tendency of a being to move toward its own completion. Not perfection by an external standard, but completion according to what is possible. Regeneration in this sense is not magic, it is fidelity to an inner direction. Heard in the night, this becomes a very gentle lullaby. You do not need to return to who you once were in order to be healed. Enough is enough. There are creatures that generate electricity, not as a weapon, but as a language, a way of communicating with the surrounding world, measuring, orienting, sensing. Electricity here is not loud, it is precise. It appears when needed, and withdraws when its task is done. In darkness, electricity becomes a soft kind of sight, allowing a being to find its way without harsh light. Baruch Spinoza wrote in Ethics, "Each thing, as far as it can by its own power, strives to persevere in its being. Electricity is not used to demonstrate strength. It is a way of persisting that fits the environment." Heard at night, this releases another quiet pressure. Not every message needs to be shouted to be received. Some signals, when they are subtle and well-tuned, are already enough. And then there are creatures of extreme adaptation. They live in temperatures, pressures, or conditions that seem to forbid life altogether. Adaptation here is not a conquest of the environment, but a negotiation with it, a change in biological rhythm, an adjustment of structure, an acceptance of new limits. There are no declarations, only continuation. Heraclitus once said, "Character is fate. In nature, a species' character is precisely the way it adapts." There is no morality here, only suitability. And suitability does not require rigidity. On the contrary, it requires softness, the ability to bend with conditions without breaking. These so-called superpowers, placed side by side, form a picture very different from popular imagination. There are no heroes, no glory, only quiet solutions to the same question, how to continue. And here the thread connects smoothly with everything that came before. The universe has no center. Earth did not win. Sleep is not a shutdown. The body is an ecosystem. Life at every level does not operate through intention, but through capacity. Carl Jung wrote in The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, "In all chaos there is a cosmos, in all disorder, a secret order." Extreme adaptations are gentle proof of this secret order. From the outside they may appear chaotic. From within they are a rhythm of balance. Inevitably the reflection turns back toward the human. We do not regenerate like one creature, generate electricity like another, or endure extreme environments like a third. But we have softer equivalents. We regenerate psychologically after rupture, after loss, by assembling new pieces. We generate electricity, emotionally subtle signals that help us navigate relationships. We adapt extremely in life-changing rhythms, changing roles, learning how to live within new conditions. Rainer Maria Rilke wrote in Letters to a Young Poet, "Let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. Just keep going." Keep going here does not mean charging forward. It means continuing in the rhythm that fits. Sometimes advancing, sometimes retreating, sometimes standing still long enough for inner structures to change. The healing of this chapter lies in demystifying strength. When we stop dreaming of extraordinary powers, we begin to value the very small capacities that work each night, the ability to mend, the ability to adjust, the ability to go on in silence. No audience required, no certification needed. In the low, even cadence of night, these superpowered creatures become a lullaby of humility. They do not teach us how to surpass, they teach us how to fit. And fitting, as nature endlessly demonstrates, lasts far longer than breaking through. As sleep deepens, allow these images to pass like quiet beings moving in the dark. No need to remember names, no need to hold details, only feel something very simple. Life has more ways of continuing than we usually imagine, and most of those ways are not loud. At this point, the current of thought flows on smoothly. From the inner ecosystem, we open outward to the larger one, and then return to ourselves not as a center, but as a part that can learn from quiet solutions, a part that can trust in the capacity to self-adjust. And tonight, if you feel you possess no superpower at all, this chapter whispers something kind. You do not need one. Everything necessary for this night is already present. The ability to let go, the ability to adapt, the ability to allow body and mind to work in silence. Sleep, then, is no longer a challenge. It becomes the environment in which these quiet capacities operate. No guarding, no commanding, only stillness. Let nature within and without continue its very old way of working, very slow, very steady, very effective. And let you, like every other living being, continue through this night in peace. When we have listened to living beings with their very quiet superpowers, regeneration, electricity, adaptation, a deeper layer of understanding gradually comes into view without noise, without shock. Evolution has no intention. It is neither good nor bad. It does not aim toward a noble destination. It is not moral, not purposeful. It is simply a sequence of temporary solutions retained because they were sufficiently suited to continue. Heard in the slow rhythm of night, many familiar pressures begin to dissolve. For if evolution has no goal, then our existence is not a moral exam administered by the universe. There is no judging panel, no final standard. There are only things that worked until they no longer did. Evolution does not reward the deserving nor punish the mistaken. It is indifferent to good or bad intentions. It preserves structures that help a being survive within a particular context. When the context changes, those same structures may become unnecessary, even harmful. There is no tragedy here, only a quiet update. Charles Darwin wrote in On the Origin of Species, natural selection is daily and hourly scrutinizing throughout the world every variation, even the slightest, rejecting that which is bad, preserving, and adding up all that is good. Here, good carries no moral meaning. It simply means suitable in that moment. And heard through the ears of night, this can bring a profound sense of relief. For if evolution has no destination, then human beings do not need to carry a grand role to justify their existence. We are not the pinnacle, not the conclusion, not the final answer. We are a temporary solution, a working response in a specific condition at a specific time. Friedrich Nietzsche, in Beyond Good and Evil, questioned the absolute values humans assign to themselves. He wrote, "There are no moral phenomena at all, only a moral interpretation of phenomena." From this perspective, evolution does not act according to morality. Morality is the way humans interpret the consequences of evolution when living together. This does not render life meaningless. On the contrary, it frees meaning from the burden of having to be eternal. If there is no final goal, then each moment does not need to lead toward a grand conclusion to be worth living. It only needs to be sufficiently attuned to the present. At night, as breathing slows, this idea can be felt clearly in the body. The heart does not ask about purpose. The lungs do not pursue intention. They function because conditions allow them to function, and when conditions change, they adjust. Without judgment, without nostalgia. Heraclitus once said, "Everything flows." Evolution is that flow with no final shore, no destined sea. And within it, what exists are temporary ways of continuing. Some last long, some briefly. There is no ranking. Here, the thread of thought connects smoothly with earlier chapters. Creatures with superpowers are not blessed. Their traits were once solutions. Ecosystems function not because someone controls them, but because feedback loops find balance. And evolution at its deepest level is simply the accumulation of what has been enough. Henri Bergson in Creative Evolution spoke of life as a creative force without a fixed blueprint. Without needing a direct quotation, the spirit is clear. Evolution tries, keeps discards not for meaning, but for continuation. When humans apply the idea of purpose to themselves, exhaustion often follows. We ask, what am I here for? Am I on the right path? Am I developing correctly? But seen through the lens of evolution, the question softens what is helping me live right now. Albert Camus wrote in The Myth of Sisyphus, "The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart, not because there is a summit, but because there is movement." Evolution does not promise a reward at the end of the road. It only allows the road to continue. The healing of this chapter lies in releasing the pressure to be right. If evolution has no goal, then life does not need to match a predefined script. You have not failed because you did not become a certain model. You are simply trying another way of existing. And if that way is no longer suitable, body and mind will adjust as they have done for millions of years. In the low, even cadence of night, evolution ceases to be a story of ruthless competition. It becomes a lullaby about impermanence. There is nothing to strain to keep forever, nothing to rush toward. Only solutions that are good enough for today. Rainer Maria Rilke wrote in Letters to a Young Poet, "Live the questions now." To live with questions is not to resolve them immediately, but to allow time to do its work. Evolution lives these questions through experimentation. Human beings can learn to live with uncertainty without fear. As night deepens, as sleep draws near, the idea of no goal becomes deeply comforting. You do not need to go anywhere right now. You do not need to become anything. Body and mind only need to maintain a balance that is just enough to carry you through the night. And if tomorrow the conditions change, you will change with them, not as a betrayal of yourself, but as a very gentle survival reflex. Not because you lack direction, but because the only direction of life is continuation. At this point, the current of thought flows on smoothly. From learning that we do not need superpowers to exist, we learn that we do not need a grand meaning to be at peace. Evolution does not ask you to be better than yesterday. It asks only that you be sufficiently attuned to the present. Tonight, as you close your eyes, you may allow yourself to set aside one large question: who must I become? Not because the question is wrong, but because it can wait. Evolution has always worked without complete answers. Sleep then becomes a very old solution, so old that no one remembers when it began. No goal, no morality. Just the way life keeps itself through the night. Let that flow continue, very slowly, very evenly, without intention, and let you, like every other living being in the long story of life, rest not in order to achieve something, but simply to continue. When the idea of evolution has finally settled that there is no intention, no ultimate goal, only solutions that are sufficient to continue, a very quiet mirror is placed once more before the human being, not to judge, but to reflect. And in that mirror, a simple truth appears without shock, without collapse. Human beings are not special, not the center, not the destination, not the conclusion of a long cosmic story. And yet at the very same time, something else appears light as breath. Human beings still have a place. Not special at first, this can touch an old and familiar unease. We are often taught that we are different, central to meaning creatures with a mission. But in the slow rhythm of night, when we stop searching for the leading role, that feeling softens. Because not being special does not mean being meaningless. It only means that we belong to the same current that forms stone trees, oceans, and countless other quiet forms of life. The philosopher Baruch Spinoza once wrote, "In ethics, man is a part of nature, not a kingdom within a kingdom." Human beings are not a separate realm. We are part of a larger structure where everything exists through interaction, not privilege. Heard at night, this releases a very familiar weight. We do not need to carry the universe on our shoulders in order to be acknowledged. And when this not being special is accepted, a space opens, not a space of lack, but of possibility. If we are not the center, we are free from the pressure to be perfect. If we are not the destination, we are allowed to remain midway without shame. Human beings seen this way fit the world more gently, neither inflated nor diminished. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote, "Inhuman, all too human. To become what one is, one must not have the faintest notion of what one is." This line does not encourage confusion, but invites us to release fixed ideas about the self. When we stop anchoring ourselves to a special position, we begin to live more flexibly, as all living beings have always done. But not special is not the end of the story. It becomes the ground upon which another awareness can stand. There is still a place that does not come from superiority, but from suitability. Human beings have a very particular way of being present, not higher, but different in kind. We have language to tell, memory to connect, the ability to listen to ourselves in the night and to ask questions more gently. Albert Camus once wrote in The Myth of Sisyphus, "The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. No summit is required as justification. The simple fact of moving, of feeling, of thinking is already a complete form of presence." The human place lies in the capacity to remain with questions without demanding immediate answers. Here, the current of thought flows seamlessly from the previous chapters. If evolution has no goal, then there is no ultimate measure by which to rank living beings. If ecosystems function without a commander, then human beings do not need power in order to belong. We are here because conditions allow it. And tonight, that is enough. Martin Heidegger once wrote, "In being and time being in the world, human beings do not stand outside the world to observe it. We are in it. Our place is not a pedestal, but the ground beneath our feet, sometimes damp, sometimes unstable, but real." The healing of this chapter lies in a very gentle balance between humility and appreciation. We do not need to elevate ourselves to have value, nor do we need to diminish ourselves to appear wise. We only need to place ourselves correctly as a listening part of a much larger whole. And in that position, many pressures dissolve the pressure to be special, to be right, to be superior. Rainer Maria Rilke once wrote in Letters to a Young Poet, "Try to learn to love what is simply there. To love what is present is to love one's place. Not an ideal position, but a real one. A place with fatigue, with limits, with nights that ask for quiet. As the night deepens, the voice can slow even further, because this realization does not need to be debated. It needs to be accompanied. Human beings are not special because the universe offers no crown, and yet human beings still have a place because the universe allows it, allows breathing, allows sleeping, allows the telling of very small stories in the dark. And here we touch a truth that is especially gentle. The human place is not at the center of the light, but in the ability to grow familiar with the dark. Not to dominate, but to coexist. Not to resolve every question, but to keep them warm through the night. If during the day you have ever felt not remarkable enough, not distinctive enough, this chapter whispers something kind. You do not need to stand out in order to belong. Belonging comes from rhythm, the rhythm of breath, of sleep, of a life that is just enough, from being here now, listening in silence. At this point, the current of thought continues to flow smoothly. From releasing the intention of evolution, we also release the intention to be special. And when that intention falls away, a place reveals itself not as a reward, but as a ground that has always been there. Tonight, as you close your eyes, you may allow yourself to be exactly where you are. Not higher, not lower. Without comparison. Simply a human being in the universe close enough to feel small enough not to carry everything. And in that place, sleep arrives more gently. Not because every question has been answered, but because you are no longer standing in the wrong position. You have placed yourself back into the current where you do not need to be special in order to rest. Let the mirror close. No conclusion is required. Only remain quietly in your place and allow the night to do the rest. When human beings have looked back at themselves and accepted that they are not special, yet still have a place, a very light next step opens not as a surrender, but as a rest. Because much of human exhaustion comes from a silent effort to stand at the center of everything. At the center of the universe, at the center of meaning, at the center of unanswered questions. Tonight, perhaps we can place that burden down. Not needing to be the center means not needing to understand the universe in order to exist within it. The universe existed long before we asked our first question, and it will continue to move after those questions have quietly dissolved. Human understanding, beautiful and worthy as it is, remains only a thin layer of light enough to take a few steps forward, not to illuminate the entire sky. And when this is accepted, it brings a very deep gentleness. Ludwig Wittgenstein once wrote in Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, whereof one cannot speak thereof, one must be silent. This silence is not a failure of thought, but a necessary boundary that keeps thought from exhausting itself. There are things that only need to be sat beside, not explained. Not needing to be the center also means not needing to solve every question. By day, we often treat questions as problems that must be processed. But by night, questions can become companions walking with us into sleep, not demanding immediate answers. When questions are no longer forced, they soften. And in that softness, the mind loosens its tension. Soren Kierkegaard once wrote, in concluding unscientific postscript, life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. If understanding only arrives afterward, then living does not need to wait for understanding to be complete. Night is the time when we are allowed to live without having to prove anything. Here, the current of thought connects very naturally with the earlier chapters. If evolution has no goal, if human beings are not the destination, then having to understand the entire universe in order to have a place becomes an unnecessary demand. We are here not because we have solved the great equation, but because conditions allow it, like every other living being. Albert Einstein once said, "The most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious." The mysterious does not need to be broken open to be beautiful. It is beautiful because it is allowed to remain mysterious. When we stop treating not knowing as a deficiency, it becomes a resting space for the mind. Not needing to be the center also helps us stop using ourselves as the measure of all things. When we no longer stand in the middle, the world no longer revolves around personal anxiety. The stars continue to burn. The seas continue to rise and fall. The night continues to descend. And within this continuation, we can lean into the flow instead of resisting it. Martin Heidegger called this state Gelassenheit, a deliberate letting be, allowing things to be. Even without direct quotation, the spirit is clear. Allow the world to be the world, and allow yourself to be yourself without an added central role. The healing of this chapter lies in removing responsibilities that do not belong to us. We do not need to carry the task of understanding the universe in order to sleep peacefully. We do not need to finish every question in order to rest. Just as a planet does not need to know the orbit of the entire galaxy in order to turn correctly, a human being does not need to know every answer in order to live enough. Rainer Maria Rilke once wrote in Letters to a Young Poet, "Try to love the questions themselves. To love questions is to allow them to remain without pressure. And night is the best time for that love, quiet, unforced, without demand." As the voice slows, as the light softens, we may feel a very small yet very real change in the body. The shoulders drop, the jaw loosens, the breath lengthens. These are signs of no longer standing at the center, no longer needing to hold everything under control, no longer guarding meaning. And at that moment, sleep draws closer, not as a reward, but as the natural consequence of letting go. Letting go of the central role, letting go of the need to understand everything, letting go of the pressure to conclude. At this point, the current of thought flows smoothly from accepting the human place. We learn how to step slightly to the side, enough to see, enough to feel, but not to block the sky. Stepping aside in order to hear the night speak in a language that does not need translation. If during the day you have felt that you must clarify everything this chapter whispers, something very gentle, night does not need clarity. Night needs depth. And depth does not come from adding more light, but from turning some of it off. Let the universe remain, not fully understood. Let questions remain unanswered. Let yourself not be at the center. Within this allowing, there is a kind of peace that needs no proof, a peace that arrives when we stop demanding that meaning appear before we are allowed to sleep. And as you close your eyes, you may allow yourself to do what the universe has always done, continue without explanation. Sleep then is no longer something to achieve. It becomes the natural state of a living being that has stepped out of the middle of everything. The night will do the rest, very slowly, very evenly, without a center. When human beings have accepted that they do not need to be the center, that they do not need to understand the universe or resolve every question in order to rest, a very small yet very important movement becomes possible, setting knowledge down. Not denying the value of understanding, but placing it aside at the right moment, like setting a heavy backpack next to the bed before lying down. By day, knowledge is a tool. It helps us orient ourselves, predict outcomes, and exert some measure of control over the world. But when night arrives, that same tool can become a burden. Unfinished concepts, undigested information, open questions. The brain, accustomed to operating in analytical mode, continues working even when the body is already tired. And sleep, which is meant to be a natural process, becomes blocked by the need to understand more, think more, connect more. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein once wrote in Philosophical Investigations, "Philosophy is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language." Sometimes intelligence is not bewitched by the world, but by the very concepts it creates. At night, when the body needs rest, continuing to carry those concepts is like asking the brain to stand guard over the entire universe. Setting knowledge down does not mean abandoning curiosity or betraying intelligence. It simply means placing it aside for a while, like a reader who knows when to close the book once the eyes have grown tired, like a musician who knows when to stop practicing so the ears can rest. Knowledge does not disappear when it is set down. It is preserved by not being dragged into a place where it does not belong. Here, the flow of thought connects seamlessly with the previous chapter. If we do not need to be the center, we also do not need to play the role of the one who understands everything. If we do not need to solve every question, we do not need to carry every answer into sleep. Night is not the space of accumulated knowledge. Night is the space where knowledge settles. Soren Kierkegaard once wrote in Fear and Trembling, "The function of prayer is not to influence God, but rather to change the nature of the one who prays." Setting knowledge down works in the same way. It does not change the value of knowledge. It changes the state of the one who carries it from tension to softness, from control to permission. The brain, like every other ecosystem, needs cycles, cycles of focus and cycles of release. When we do not allow it to rest from processing meaning, it continues analyzing even during sleep, producing tangled dreams, middle of the night, awakenings, and a sense of fatigue despite having lain down long enough. Allowing the brain to rest is not laziness. It is a biological condition for the brain to function well again tomorrow. William James, in The Principles of Psychology, described consciousness as a stream rather than an on-off machine. That stream needs stretches of still water. Without them, it becomes turbulent, folding in on itself. Sleep is that necessary stillness, and knowledge, if not set down, can keep the surface from ever becoming calm. In modern life, setting knowledge down has become harder than ever. We carry news into bed. We carry analysis, comparison, prediction. We lie there, the body in darkness, while the mind keeps the lights on. And that light, instead of guiding us, becomes blinding. The philosopher Martin Heidegger called this state of release Gelassenheit, a letting be, letting thought rest, letting the world no longer require further grasping, letting the brain step out of the role of manager of meaning. In that spirit, sleep ceases to be a task to complete and becomes the natural consequence of letting go. Rainer Maria Rilke once wrote in Letters to a Young Poet, "Have patience with everything unresolved in your heart." To be patient with what remains unresolved also means not dragging it into sleep, not because it is unimportant, but because it can wait. Night is not the time to finish things. Night is the time to preserve energy for finishing later. The healing of this chapter lies in a very small gesture, allowing the brain to rest without guilt. Many people fear that if they stop thinking, they will lose control. But in truth, it is rest that allows the brain to restructure, filter out noise, and retain what truly matters. Knowledge integrates best when it is not forced to work continuously. As the voice slows, as the sentences grow more spacious, you may begin to feel the difference between understanding and being at ease. Understanding requires effort. Being at ease requires permission. And at night, being at ease is enough. Here, the current of the entire journey begins to close very naturally, from looking up at the sky to accepting limits to not needing to be the center. We arrive at a very quiet point, not needing to carry everything into sleep, not needing to carry the universe, not needing to carry questions, not even needing to carry yourself as a project that must be completed. If by day you are someone who thinks deeply, this chapter does not ask you to stop thinking forever. It only invites you to take the night shift off. Set intelligence down in its chair. Dim the lights. Allow the brain to enter maintenance mode where it does not create new meaning but keeps you intact. And as you lie down tonight, you may try one very small, very real gesture. Imagine yourself placing knowledge beside you, not throwing it away, not denying it, simply placing it down, like placing a book on the table, like laying a coat over a chair. The rest you do not need to do. The brain knows how to rest when it is given permission. Sleep knows how to arrive when it is no longer blocked by unfinished questions. Setting knowledge down is not abandoning intelligence, but trusting that intelligence will return after you have rested. And in that very quiet trust, the night closes. Sleep open. When knowledge has been set down, when questions are allowed to remain without demanding answers, this journey touches a very quiet point, sleep as a philosophical act, not as a blankness of consciousness, but as a subtle choice. In this light, sleep is not an escape. Sleep is an acceptance of limits, and within that acceptance lives a gentle strength that daytime rarely allows us to notice. Escape is turning away from reality out of fear. Sleep is different. Sleep is a return to a deeper reality of the body. When we sleep, we do not deny the world. We place the world back into its proper scale. We acknowledge that consciousness cannot carry everything at once, that there are processes which must unfold when we step away from the center. Sleep then becomes a very ancient philosophical gesture, knowing when to stop. The philosopher Aristotle, in On Sleep and Waking, regarded sleep as a natural and necessary state for life to continue, not because humans are weak, but because life has rhythm. That rhythm cannot stretch endlessly in wakefulness without exhausting itself. Sleep is how life says enough for today. Here, the flow of thought connects smoothly with all that came before. We learn that we do not need to be the center. We do not need to understand the universe. We do not need to solve every question. We learned how to set knowledge down, and now we learn the final lesson to set wakefulness itself down, not as a failure, but as an agreement with the natural limits of being human. Soren Kierkegaard once wrote, "In the sickness unto death, the greatest hazard of all losing oneself can occur very quietly in the world." Sleep in this sense is not the loss of the self. On the contrary, it is a way of keeping oneself by refusing to let the ego be drained through the demand to remain constantly present. Accepting limits is not abandoning aspiration. It is placing aspiration in its proper time. By day, aspiration may guide us. By night, aspiration needs rest. Sleep does not erase desire. It protects desire from becoming violent toward the very body that gives it life. Martin Heidegger spoke of Gelassenheit letting be as a deep mode of existence. Sleep is Gelassenheit at its most fundamental, letting thoughts stop, letting the world continue without our supervision, letting the body work in its own rhythm. No resistance, no forcing, no demand. In modern life, many people carry a quiet guilt about sleeping, as if rest were wasteful, as if it were an avoidance of responsibility. But seen philosophically, sleep is responsibility toward finitude. We sleep not because the world does not matter, but because the world matters too much to be met when we are depleted. Sleep is the promise we make to tomorrow that we will return whole enough to meet it. Albert Camus once wrote in The Myth of Sisyphus, "Real generosity toward the future lies in giving all to the present." Sleep is a very real generosity toward the future because it gives the present what it needs: most rest. Without rest, every effort dries out. When we say sleep is acceptance of limits, we are not speaking of resignation. We are speaking of the intelligence of stopping, like a climber who knows when to turn back as night falls, like a musician who knows when to lift their hands so the echo can settle, like a storyteller who knows where to end so the listener can carry the story into sleep. Rainer Maria Rilke once wrote in Letters to a Young Poet, "I live my life in widening circles. Sleep is a narrowing circle, not to suffocate, but to prepare for the next widening. Without the closing of a circle, the opening that follows would tear. At this point, the voice may slow even more, because nothing remains to be proven." The entire journey from the night sky, from the Big Bang, from the limits of knowledge, from black holes, from Earth's fragility, from the layers of sleep, from the body, from ecosystems, from evolution without purpose, from not needing to be the center, from setting knowledge down. All of it leads here a very human, very ancient, very gentle gesture: closing the eyes. Closing the eyes is not turning away. It is an act of trust. Trust that good processes continue when we are not watching. Trust that the world does not collapse when we rest. Trust that the self does not disappear when we release the role of understanding everything. Ludwig Wittgenstein once wrote, "The solution of the problem of life is seen in the vanishing of the problem." In sleep, many problems are not solved, they dissolve, not because we have defeated them, but because we no longer stand in the place where they demand answers. The healing of this final chapter lies in allowing ourselves to be finite without shame. To be finite means to need rest. It means not being able to hold everything in the mind. It means at times handing control back to the body, to biological rhythm, to the gentle dark. Tonight, as you lie still, you may whisper to yourself very softly, "Sleep is not escape." You are not running from questions, you are placing them into the time that suits them. You are not rejecting the world, you are trusting that the world is stable enough to wait until morning. And then, in the very small moment before sleep arrives, when thoughts grow sparse, when the breath lengthens, you may feel a simple truth: accepting limits does not make us smaller. It brings us back to the right size to be cared for, the right size to be held, the right size to sleep. Let sleep be the final philosophical act of this night. No declaration, no conclusion. Only a quiet agreement with what has always been true: human beings need rest. And in that agreement, everything closes at the right moment. Not with an answer, but with a silence deep enough to carry you into sleep in peace. And now, as this journey quietly comes to a close, not with an answer, but with a pause. Perhaps what matters most is not what you have just heard, but what you no longer need to carry. Along this path, we have traveled very far. From the first night sky humans ever looked up to, through the silent expansions of the universe, the limits of understanding, black holes, fragile worlds, the cycles of sleep, the quiet movements of the body, and finally the gentle acceptance that we do not need to be the center in order to be at peace. If everything had to be gathered into one very simple truth, perhaps it would be this: you do not need to understand everything in order to be allowed to rest. You do not need to hold the role of the thinker until the end of the night. The universe will continue to move. The body will still know how to care for you. The questions can remain there very quietly until morning arrives. Right now, you may allow yourself to let go a little more. Let go of the rhythm of the day. Let go of the light. Let go even of the need to follow this story to its end. There is nothing to complete, nothing to prove. Only you remain and sleep, already waiting like a place very familiar that you do not need to search for. Thank you for staying long enough to walk through this journey. If sleep has already arrived, let it carry you onward, very gently, very deeply. And if you are still listening, remember this: everything important can wait until morning. Wishing you a peaceful night and a truly restful sleep.